Hi, Jay. Welcome to Potterwatch.
Hi, I'm J Dickinson from the Anthropology department at UVM.
And what question have you brought for us today, Jay?
So my question is, why don't the wizards share one way of speaking or one accent in opposition to Muggles, instead of sounding like the Muggles that they live among in the various regions of Great Britain or Europe, for that matter?
And what is your answer?
My answer is that Rowling has kind of done a big swing and a mess here on the way that people actually talk, and the way that community influences our language and our accents. Because what we generally see is that people tend to talk like the people they talk to the most, so the people they're closest to, and they tend to speak differently from the people that they feel identity-wise that they're quite different from. And these interact in really complex ways. I'm not going to say that there isn't that there aren't sort of cases where we can see one outweighing the other, but in general, when we look at region and class and race and gender identity, all of these things interact in ways that our speech becomes often unconscious expression of who we think we are, and also a real reflection of the people we actually spend our time with. So there's a lot of long-term studies that really demonstrate this. And what we have instead is we have in the Potter books, you have Rowling really painting wizards as culturally cut off and really quite separate from Muggles. And so Arthur Weasley asking about what the function of a rubber ducky is, which is a humorous moment, also reveals a huge cultural chasm. Or even in the later books, talking about how wizards don't shop, they find food in other ways. So the idea of going to a store to purchase something, well, these are not insignificant cultural elements. So the fact that they would still have these really quite bounded British regional accents and yet be so culturally separate from the people who speak that way is kind of a paradox of the books.
Can you give us an example of any particular characters that come to mind?
Well, I mean, the obvious one is Hagrid, and the reason it's obvious is because Rowling, more so than many of the other characters, had a very specific regional accent in mind, a West Country accent, and in particular the accent that the actor uses in the movies is a Somerset accent, but the other more general features of that accent group is typical of the West Country, and it's not a very large accent area. And in terms of characterization, it's a way that she used to portray him as being simple, kind of a yokel, perhaps not very smart. So in British dialect kind of hierarchies, West Country accent is one that you would usually associate with someone who's kind of a country bumpkin and not particularly smart in the ways of the world. And we see that come out in other aspects of Hagrid's character as well. Other ones are, so a Scottish accent being associated with sort of, a strict rule-boundedness, and, that clipped Scottish accent that McGonagall has would be another one. You also see this in terms of the sort of dark and evil Eastern European, wizards, and the pretty elegant French wizards. All of these are expressed in part through national and regional accents. And also some of the rivalries, for example, Irish versus English, those come out in student characters as well that are associated very strongly with their accents.
So do you think there's an extent to which this can be explained through like Muggle, injection of muggleness into the world through Muggle-born students in the wizarding world?
Well, so here's the question, right? Again, what does it mean to be Muggle-born and become a wizard? To what extent are you letting go of your Muggleness and adopting a wizard identity? So what we would expect to see in terms of basic sociolinguistics is that wizards would have, beyond vocabulary, which they certainly have as being specific, but there would be much more dramatic linguistic reflections of a group identity among wizards. And Muggles would probably even hypercorrect into that. So they many of them would let go of any Muggle accent, vocabulary, identity, and really super adopt that wizard identity. They would be hyper wizard in the way that they speak. So certainly, yes. And I'm forgetting his name, but the Irish character whose mother is
Seamus.
yeah,
Seamus.
Seamus, obviously, right? So Seamus's mother is a witch, and his father is a Muggle, and obviously he was raised in Ireland, and so you could imagine that would be the source. It's this regular injection of these regional identities, but they're not necessarily. In that case, they met in Ireland and they stayed in Ireland, and he grew up in Ireland. But if all of these Muggles are meeting their mates at Hogwarts, you would expect there to be, just as there is in Great Britain today, a much more a mix and match quality to these families. And in general, children do not speak like their parents. They speak like the people they speak with the most. They speak like their peers. So if your parents are Irish, but you grew up in London, you're going to have a London accent, and you might pick up more Irishness when you travel to visit your relatives in Ireland, particularly if you're trying to express, you're acclimating, you're moving, accommodating to them, and moving towards trying to express a more Irish identity. But your most, your accent that you're going to use in everyday life when you're not hyper aware of your identity is really going to be that London accent, because that's where you grew up.
I've been really struck in this book, and I'm going to have to put a spoilers thing on the description here, by the way that Barty Crouch Jr. tries to embody Moody through Scottish vocabulary. And I had to look up, because I know David Tennant plays Barty Crouch Jr. in the movies, but in the books, he is not meant to be Scottish. And I kind of wondered, like, not knowing the real Moody yet, as we do at this point in the books, is he laying it on too thick? How is he trying to do that? And what is his thought process in terms of, like, I need to be a Scottish wizard?
Yeah. And some of that is vocabulary, but also when we think about, again, the way that Rowling used that to build characterization, there are other, it's sort of like two sides of Scottishness, right? There's the male Scottishness, which is rule breaking, and there's the female Scottishness, which is rule abiding. And you see that expressed in two Scottish characters in the book. So there's a lot of stereotyping that is used as a kind of a shorthand for character building, which is obviously totally common. And that's much more apparent in the movies, but it also appears in the books. And I guess I just have mixed feelings about it, because there are a lot of misconceptions about the extent to which we can control the way that we speak, and those get all bound up with things like, well, if the way you speak is stigmatized and people think poorly of you because of it, why don't you just stop doing that and start doing this other thing? And in fact, that kind of accent migration is extremely difficult. People pay a lot of money to have coaches help them do that. Similarly, you have people who change countries. So they move from one country to another, and they need to speak in a new language, and are often very aware of the extent to which their speech deviates from the speech of the people around them. And they work very hard to accommodate to their new speech situation, but it's difficult to achieve a perfect accent. So some of the perceptions we have about how easy this is to do, and the extent to which language reflects inner qualities of ourselves, doesn't really correspond to what we know about speech, and also our ability to control it, and also the sources of differences between different groups and how they speak. So I can, in my mind, I would have loved it if instead Rowling had created a world in which wizards speak in this slightly different way, and it's not so different that they can't kind of fake it when they're speaking to Muggles. And there are I think some humorous incidents where you have wizards trying to be Muggle and just completely missing the mark, and generally that's through clothing, but it could also be done somewhat through language. And then you would have this exploration of what it means to be Muggle born and to move into this new environment and take on this really dramatic change in your identity, to join a community that defines itself as being separate. So even the most warm and welcoming of wizards still recognizes themselves as being fundamentally different from Muggles, and promotes the separateness culturally and societally of wizards from muggles. So it would be really cool if the language in the books really reflected that more.
Yeah. So another thing I wanted to ask you, you and I are in a book club together, and we read a book, To Like the Lightning, in which they've made flying cars that go really fast, such that you can live in South America somewhere and commute to Chicago for work in like 45 minutes. So I was thinking when we were talking about port keys and apparating, the ways in which the wizarding world, similarly, you can travel pretty great distances, almost instantaneously. And thinking about how in the book that we read, that really made people's national identity a lot less salient. And I was wondering why in the wizarding world, we still see those national identities as being like really important.
Yeah. So I'm going to say two things. One, when the telephone was invented, and then later when television and radio and then television became popular, all of these technological changes, the invention of the automobile, commercial air travel, all of these things promoted the idea that boundaries would disappear, and these might include linguistic boundaries, that people would all begin to speak alike. And in fact, it is not the case that everyone speaks like the news announcer on television, which was an assumption that that would happen. One of the reasons for that is, again, television news announcers are trained to speak in a certain way. So they have to take on a new accent that is a broadcast accent. And so it doesn't correspond to the way that anyone speaks. But in fact, the reception that we have, the language that we receive from these technological interactions is nothing like the one-on-one face-to-face interaction, which is the primary movement of language change. And the second thing is, when you have really fast travel, it allows people to interact with each other more. And it is clear that wizards travel. We have both vacation travel and other kinds of travel represented in the books. But that is not their peer group, right? They're not part of an international peer group where you live in England, but you go visit your friend, you apparate and go visit your friend for tea in Egypt, right? You have a portrayal of communities that are much more geographically bound than their technology would assume for them to be. And to feed into that, the importance of these national identities as embodied in Quidditch team affiliation, and even more importantly, remember, all these kids, these wizard kids, they go to boarding schools. So they leave their home at the age of 11 and they go to a boarding school, which is essentially a geographically bounded experience. British wizards, they might be sent far afield, but in general, they go to Hogwarts, or in general, they go to, I can't remember the name of the French one. They go to these regional and, to a lesser degree, nationally based boarding schools. And at those boarding schools, they gain an identity that is based on their school. But at the same time, I suspect that, as is the case now in international boarding schools, their national identities also play an integral role in their self-presentation and their sense that they're representing something that exists outside themselves. That something is their national identity, and that's where we see the Quidditch teams. That's where we see the rivalries that are bound up in those national identities. And you see that even internally with the Irish versus English teams as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you, Jay. This has been very educational.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun.